adaptive sports as part of the Move United Leadership Conference. My name is Wyatt Gomez Garcia, and I am the Senior Manager with Move United, formerly known as Disabled Sports USA. We'd like to take a minute to thank the Bob Woodruff Foundation for their long-standing support and allowing us to bring this virtual opportunity to you this week. Before turning it over to our presenters today, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. All attendees will be on mute to minimize distractions. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit questions rather than the chat functionality. But we do want to encourage the chat functionality use, so feel free to use the chat function to introduce yourselves. We invite you to share where you're joining us from today, and remember to change that chat setting to send messages to all panelists and attendees to engage with everyone in this webinar. Now, I will turn it over to our presenters. Eli?
Great. Thank you so much, Myra, and everyone at Move United for having us, my colleague Mary Holmes, and also Mike Cottingham. We're really looking forward to today's presentation, Next Generation and the Future of Adaptive Sport. And so we're going to kick it off just sharing this powerful message, Nelson Mandela, where he spoke about the power that sport has to change the world. It has the power to inspire, it has potential to unite people in a way that little else does. A lot of the work that we've done is very broad. It kind of looks at how sport can be a vehicle for social change and transformation. And so this is something that really roots with us and carries us forward in our work. And so today our presentation is going to be about adaptive sport, but really this work that we do has been broader. And so in 2011, my colleague Mary, yes.
I can't see the PowerPoint. I don't know if anyone else can or not. I can see you, but not the PowerPoint.
Can you guys see the PowerPoint, Myra?
Yes.
Okay.
I can't.
So in 2000, I'm going to carry forward, Mary. It's okay.
Okay.
In 2011, Mary and I and our other colleague, Ted Fay and David Legge, we established the Power of Sport Lab. And that work, again, is kind of this broader platform around looking at sport as it relates to creating change, how it can fuel and magnify creativity, diversity, connection, and leadership through sport. We've had this message: inform, empower, and transform. And so the projects that we've had over the years, the very first initiative that we developed was the Disability in Sport program, Disability in Sport International. But our other projects have been around Athletes for Human Rights. We've collaborated for many years with the Muhammad Ali Center in Louisville. We've also developed the Olympism Project. That's a project that's worked quite closely with broader Olympic and Paralympic values, particularly with the International Olympic Academy based in Greece. And then a more recent project has been Mentoring for Change, which has been looking at the power of mentoring in sport and the role that mentoring plays in our sports culture. And so just briefly on Disability in Sport International, this again was a project that we established. And again, it's back in 2000, for 20 years now, we've actually been engaging in work related to adaptive sport and athletes with disabilities in the sporting environment. And our work has really focused on research, education, and advocacy, particularly focusing on inclusion and integration. Part of what we've been really interested in is looking at how do we change the paradigm of bringing people with disabilities from the margins to become integral members of the sporting culture and the sporting community. So yes, for 20 years now, we've been involved with this work and really engaging at how do we move forward. But again, disability has been one piece of this broader power of sport conversation. And so today we're really looking at this whole idea of the next generation. And so we wanted to be able to put that into context. This is now the 30th anniversary. Here we are in 2020. So this would be the 30th year anniversary of the ADA. And so this term began to develop about 5 years ago. So around the 25th anniversary, the term of the ADA generation started to develop. And so this notion of the ADA generation and how do we apply it to adaptive sports and disability is this whole notion of expectations, of raising our expectations. So when we begin to think about inclusion and integration, when we think about moving from just a baseline of access to thinking about what does it really mean for inclusion and integration in our society, in our sports culture to really be happening. And so thinking about disability into the mainstream, thinking about disability in all levels and all aspects of the sports industry. So again, to think about the fact that disability is not an adaptive sport, is not just an afterthought, it's not just charity or not like, oh, we're doing a favor to this community, but in fact, adaptive sport and athletes with disabilities are central and essential to the sports culture. And so I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague Mary to talk about this piece of the presentation, which is on the disability identity in sport. So over to you, Mary.
Right. Okay. And Eli, again, I cannot see the PowerPoint. So, I mean, I don't see your screen. I'm using the PowerPoint off my computer. So you might have to tell me when you go from slide to slide.
Okay.
Okay. So anyway, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Move United, for having us here today. This is awesome. It's great that we could all be together in this space at this time. Yeah, Eli was talking about, you know, the new next generation. That's what we're talking about here. And this little pictogram that I've got in front of us right now with disability identity in sport. You know, when we think about next generations and new generations, people now, younger people, certainly younger people than myself, think more in terms of identity. They think more in terms of movement and how they belong. And they think about cross-identification as well. So I thought that this little button was kind of a nice picture that reminds us that different people have different identities. And we've sort of moved through recognition of these identities in phases. You know, maybe racial identity started first, more about gender identity, and now, of course, the LGBT community. And now we're to, you know, disability. Here we come. And when we think about using our identity or thinking about next generations, if you will, I'm going to refer back to women's sports. When Title IX was passed in the late 70s, you know, we sort of had the birth of the Title IX generation that emerged, that was born to our sporting culture at the 1996 Olympic Games. That was basically a 21-year period. And now we're looking at just over, you know, at 30, right, with ADA. Again, time for a generation. So now, you know, it is time for us to start thinking about disability as an identity, having pride in being a person with a disability. And the little pictogram, although it looks like separate pieces of pie, we all know that these cross over. I mean, I look at this and I see myself, and I'm a woman with a disability, so I sort of tick two of the boxes. So they're not meant to be separate. They work together. They are, in fact, you know, same struggle, different difference. So that's just a nice image for you to have. So Eli, I'm gonna throw it on back over to you. Thank you.
Yes. Excellent. Yeah, I think that part of this is to really think about the whole notion of, you know, moving forward and inclusion and integration, and how that also relates to the disability identity piece. So thank you, Mary, for that. So as we move from kind of this broader conversation of the ADA generation, of making sure we're talking about identity, we now wanted to start to share this piece about looking forward. What are some of the key components? So we wanted to frame this conversation around leadership and advocacy. So when we start to talk about leadership and advocacy in the context of the next generation, we had a few points that we wanted to start off by sharing. And so when you start to think about leadership and advocacy, and as it relates to adaptive sport and inclusion integration, one of the first points to think about is that how are we at the table? And are we now at the table more than we were perhaps in the past? And where will we be in the future? So at the table means in the boardrooms, at the decision-making table, in every conversation that has to do with the future of sport, of adaptive sport, that disability is a conversation topic, is a priority. And so that notion of being at the table, I think, is really important in an emerging area when it comes to the next generation. If you look historically, that has been a challenge. The adaptive sport community oftentimes hasn't been at the table. And so we're now looking at how are we getting ourselves to the table. The next point is about building allies. And this point is a really important one, and we're seeing it in many different facets. We're seeing building allies within the disability community, building connections between adaptive sport and the disability movement more broadly. We're seeing building allies internally within the adaptive sport movement, making sure that there's a connection there. We're also talking, again, following on Mary's points about building allies to the women's sports movement, building allies to race and sexual orientation in sport, and these other movements, social movements that are happening in the sports culture. And so building allies and building those connections is a key part. The third point that we wanted to address when it comes to leadership and advocacy is thinking about how are we developing that next generation in terms of leadership programs. So oftentimes in our society, in our sports industry today, particularly around, I would say, women's sports, you're seeing a proliferation of programs and projects and initiatives of building the future generation, the next generation of female and women leaders in sport. And so again, this initiative of building the future generation of leadership in adaptive sport. This next point is about coordination. It's sort of how are we connected? How are we speaking, with a united voice? This whole, what we're seeing, even through the Move United, unification is amazing, because that really speaks to a lot of these points about leadership and advocacy. And then this point here about connecting with government officials. So again, to being proactive, to being engaged, to being connected, particularly at the governmental level. So this notion of leadership and advocacy, this is kind of a framework. And so we're now going to build into 3 areas. And so we're first going to start with youth participation and engagement. And so I'm going to turn it over now to our colleague, Mike Cottingham, to share some reflections on these next couple slides. So over to you, Mike.
So I'm really into empirical data. I'm into sort of seeing what we can measure and what we're able to identify. First of all, we look at an issue like youth and we think, well, as you're thinking about things like advocacy, if you're thinking about things like the next generation, having people born into this and learning this process of advocacy is crucial. So youth is really going to be an important component. So Martin did 2 studies, and he really found that the reasons that people participate in disability sport and in population-specific programming, wheelchair basketball or wheelchair tennis or what have you, is exactly the same reasons that people without disabilities participate in sport, children specifically. So youth are competing for the same reasons, right? Some want to compete, some are there for socializing, some are there for exercise, and we know that's fairly crucial. But the question that a lot of us always have is, how many kids are out there, right? When there's an effort to push for things like collegiate programs, there's an effort to push for things like just knowing the size and scope of this. We were tasked at the lab of adaptive athletics at UH with trying to determine this. It was a pretty involved process. And we basically were able to identify virtually every program that offers disability sport participation to youth in the country. So that could be programs with both adults and youth that participate together. It could be just youth programs. It could be youth programs that sort of offer an aggressive, inclusive program. So the only kids we really missed in this potentially were the ones that maybe they're the only kid with a disability that plays on their soccer team or their hockey team. We didn't catch them. So if anything, these numbers are a little bit underrepresented. And then from within these programs, we actually asked everyone to estimate what percentage of their participants were participating in other programs and how many other programs. For example, if you're running a ski clinic, those same kids may be coming out and skiing two weeks a year, but then they're also playing in their local basketball program. And then they may also be trying curling, right? So they may be participating. So we believe that there's roughly 73,000, that's our conservative estimate, participants in disability sport that are youth, and half of those are under 15 and half are 16 to 18. Those numbers are really robust. That tells you how many kids are participating out there. And then I think what's most important is we think about social media. We think about the importance of our outreach and our websites. parents of kids with disabilities and kids with disabilities recruiting with each other are the #1 reason that people are still finding these sports. The websites mattered and the social media matters. The recruitment to rehabs matters less, but it's still important. But word of mouth and knowing someone who knows a kid is really the most important tool to get kids involved in these programs. The vast majority of, about half the programs, the largest percentage of both had a competitive and recreational components. So kids could elect to compete at a higher level or participate at recreational level. And sometimes that recreational level would present itself as summer camps, physical activity type events. Sometimes it was more sort of like weekly multi-sport optional activities. And about 8% of those programs define themselves as exclusively competitive. So really there is a sort of a breadth of how kids can participate in disability sport in whatever way they want to, competitive, recreational, whatever context. And if you guys want to take a look at this technical report, feel free to reach out to me after this, or maybe when there's some questions, and I can give you a full breakdown on participants and youth and what those numbers look like. And back to Eli, I believe.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Yeah, so that's sort of a snapshot on the youth participation and engagement and some really excellent research and work that Mike and his colleagues and team has been doing for the last few years. So thank you, Mike, for sharing that. The second area that we wanted to emphasize under this umbrella of leadership and advocacy is to look at emerging trends in marketing and media. So we're going to highlight and look at a couple different dimensions of this. And so I'm going to start just to share some broader themes, and then I'm going to turn it back to Mike to kind of get into some interesting data and things like that. So when we start to think about these trends and sort of priorities and these areas of interest around marketing and media in the adaptive space, one of the things that we've been hearing, and really some of the colleagues we've been talking to around the country and so forth, is really this notion of content. So where is the content? How are we developing the content? How are we making sure to capture content? Covering the events, covering the stories, quick videos, quick snapshots. That content is so important because when the mainstream media wants to cover and wants to have access to showcasing adaptive sport, there needs to be some content. And so the more and more that we're developing content, then that's just to our advantage. And we're seeing that social media is such this amazing platform for that. And so it's now so much easier, so much more accessible to be able to develop social media content. And so this whole area of social media is really to the advantage of adaptive sports. It's really helping us break through, helping us to reach more and more audiences with the creativity, with all the innovation and all the excitement that comes through adaptive sport. Being able to leverage social media to really tell these stories is really powerful. Another trend and another area that's really essential for the domain of marketing and media is how are we really thinking about not just being on our own. It's not just adaptive sport on its own to push this content, to create an awareness, but really there's a lot of other stakeholders, there's a lot of partners, there's lots of different industry stakeholders, there's advertising companies, there's lots of different groups that are very excited about adaptive sports. And so being able to think about those types of meaningful partnerships at local levels, at national levels, that can really help to get the message out there. And so I think being strategic, being forward thinking about the kind of partnerships that we're building is really going to be part of the future. And I think what we're seeing with young people, what we're seeing with the innovation and creativity of young people in the marketing and media space is that these partnerships just become seamless. They create the networks and they make things happen. And so I think part of it is how do we then build on that leverage. This next point about findable content I think is really interesting and one that we wanted to share because it's, in some ways it's like how are we making sure that when you're going to a sports site, whether it's NBC or ESPN or CNN or any of the main sports or just general news sites, if you go into the sports section, is there a tab? Is there a findable way to then get to the adaptive sport content? And so I think as we begin to work, again, at local and national levels within the media, how do we begin to say, well, we have this great content, but we also want to make sure that it's findable. And then the last point I wanted to make was about moving toward the notion of appropriate representation. And so this is a key point, and I think this will then maybe start some interesting conversations we can have. But again, it's one thing to have content, and it's one thing to start to push adaptive sport out there. But is it really focusing and really showcasing the athletes as athletes? Is it really focusing on sport? Is it focusing on telling a powerful story, the power of sport? Or is it sort of reinforcing stereotypes? Is it reinforcing stigma? Is it still token representation? And so there's an aspect of what I would call the water boy stories or the mascot stories. And these stories are the ones that are sort of just focusing on it's one thing to have some level of inspiration, but again, these ones are sort of overdone on the inspiration, and they're the ones that really are not as much about the sport itself. And they're kind of the tearjerker stories. And again, these are the ones that tend to get there. And I think this conversation is really, I would say, the big elephant in the room. And how do we begin to challenge this notion of what are the stories we want to be told, and how do we get away from the water boy and the mascot stories? So to kind of continue this conversation, I'm going to now turn it over to Mike to share some of the research and some of the perspectives, and then we can also come back to this in the Q&A, but I'm going to now turn it over to Mike.
So we wanted to sort of look and break down, what do people mean when they say someone's inspirational if they have a disability? And what we actually found was, when we broke that down, the research showed that it was not what inspiration really is, which is this external action which we internalize and it makes us engage in life in a different way. What people were actually defining was, wow, I had rather low expectations of you and you did somewhat better than I expected, which we were able to kind of quantify. We were able to also more effectively, through this study with Dr. Wan, able to determine that we showed two people, we showed about 200 people a basketball game between deaf athletes and non-deaf athletes. And we told half of them that the athletes were deaf. We did not tell half the participants that the athletes were deaf. And the way they perceived the sport was completely different. Same shots made, same shots missed, but our preconceived notions were very different. So if they didn't know that the athletes were deaf, they focused on athleticism and performance, and they were at times critical or complimentary. But when they knew that the athletes had a disability, they immediately focused on inspiration and wanting to know their story and how they got there. So those preconceived notions about disability run really deep, and they're very ingrained. So this is not lost on practitioners, right? We have research that shows that the reality is practitioners, as well as just independent data, show us inspiration might be a hook. It might get people in the door, but if you can't almost immediately help them focus on athleticism, on performance, on socialization and engaging with other fans, they just check out. They go, wow, that's neat, and then they leave, right? So it's up to organizations to make that decision on how much they want to sort of tap into that supergrip narrative, their inspiration narrative, to get people in the door. But it can't be an effective tool because it doesn't keep them coming back, and it doesn't change them from what we define as a spectator to a fan. And these are real big challenges for us, because most of the people that run these events, as you guys know, as you guys probably understand, are former athletes. They're people that are really good at running events, but we kind of put on the back burner trying to get people in the doors, trying to get people to watch, and it's a real challenge. But finding mechanisms to help them focus on athleticism is absolutely crucial. So if you want to know who's already coming through the door, you want to talk to your sponsors. I think a lot of us make this presumption that they're people that are already tied to disability and disability sport. We have, I think, 3 to 4 studies that show only about 40 to 60% of those people either have a disability or have a close friend or family member with a disability. So we're already getting some ancillary traction. We're already getting, and that's from what I would consider like a national level regional event, so like an elite Division I rugby event or something like that, all the way to international events. Those numbers are pretty consistent. So we are getting people in the door that are strictly curious about the sport. And whether they're coming in for that trope or not, they can be turned into someone who's more highly invested into it. So there's a lot of opportunity to sort of focus on the marketing of the sport. And if you guys want to ask more questions at the Q&A, I'd love to discuss in some depth aspects of what we know about how disability sports marketed and what tactics are most effective.
Excellent. So I'll turn it over to Mary.
Okay, so I want to move us forward and really sort of some thought pieces on how we see the next generation going forward, and some of the aspects of this forward motion that we can use in the disability sport community. I'm going to talk. Well, this first slide is going to be about innovation and technology. The next one's going to be about education. But just in terms of looking at innovation and technology, looking at some product here. Certainly the Nike Fly Ease. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Nike Fly Ease product. Of course, sort of the genesis of it was a young man who had CP, and he just was frustrated. He could do many things with his classmates, but it's like, I can't tie my shoes. I want to be like everybody else. I want to put my shoes on and wear them. Well, that was sort of the genesis of that idea. It got traction. Of course, it got some pretty nice celebrity support, if you will, because LeBron James weighed in on this, as did Deladon from the WNBA. Her sister has a disability. So we're seeing some name athletes that are associating with this. And Elena Deladon, I believe she wears them when she competes in the WNBA. So they're getting on feet of people who they'll be seeing. But again, the idea of just opening up his shoe so that you can sort of pop it open, put your foot in, strap it up, and go. It's a good example of universal design in a sporting goods product. It's sort of elegant, and it's really in its simplicity. So we see that with the Nike Fly Ease shoe. Now, I want to talk some other areas of innovation as well that go sort of into the esports and video game realm. We not just young people, of course, play these games and compete in them, but it's a pretty primary audience, tends to be a little bit younger. But when we think, trying to think innovatively about moving adaptive sport forward, let's think about the idea of, especially those two bullets, the first two, adaptive sport video games and adaptive sport esports. So, kind of what I'm thinking about there is, anybody, you can play FIFA, the FIFA sport video games, or, virtual golf, or the NCAA games, whatever it might be. But that's all traditional sport. But what about having a video game where the sport itself is wheelchair basketball? That's what everyone is competing in, is wheelchair basketball, or wheelchair rugby, or bocce, whatever it might be. But having that as the game, as the sport that people are competing in. Again, just trying to get more eyes on the sport itself, and say, hey, this, we can play the NBA game, or we could play this wheelchair basketball game, and it is still a sport video game, and sort of mainstreaming that, if you will, but getting that out in front of people. And again, you've got to then find the sponsors, get the partnerships where it's going to be a meaningful sponsorship and partnership to move that forward. And again, getting the eyes on it. Social media, of course, would be a good way to do that as well. So, thinking about adaptive sport video games and adaptive sport esports. And then the third point I have up there, and Eli and I had a long discussion about this the other day, putting it on and I said, what, I'm gonna throw it out there. People may just say, what the heck, and blow it up, or they might say, well, I don't know what you're going to say. But this idea of gamers with disabilities. Now, we have to start by saying some people will and will not agree that esports are sports. All right, so I get that there's a discussion, sport and games happen on a continuum. So are esports games, are they sports, are they competitions? All right, whatever you would think they would be. And I know there's a difference of opinion. But we're starting to see more and more multi-sport organizations, for example, state games, the Asian games, having esport competitions on the program, as part of the program. So what if, and there's two sides to this now, would it be possible to have a classification for gamers with disabilities, to be a particular classification in a competition? And to have that, and let's just go out for the big banana here. What if it was on the Paralympic Games? And the gamers would have to have certain type of disability to be qualified to compete at Paralympic Games esports. Well, and then again, and yet I get it. On the other hand, there will be people who will say, but wait, when I am playing esports, my disability doesn't matter. So I don't want to be labeled as having a disability. So I think it's a point of discussion. And that's why I threw it out here, because I figured this is a good group who might just have some thoughts about it. You know, the esports industry is, I think this year bypassed the $1 billion mark in value, dollar value. And that's a lot of eyes. If you can get those eyes on disability sport, I think that's a great audience. So something for you to think about. The other point that I have on here in terms of technology is having access to equipment for people with disabilities. And of course, I think a lot of you are probably familiar with Motivation, who has created a line of more affordable multi-sport sport chairs for both young people and adults. And of course, that's always been an issue for many, many people is, yes, I'd like to play these sports, but the cost is prohibitive. So I think the more that people can be innovative in design, innovative in product development, in who they bring in on their product development teams, thinking about how we can make equipment more accessible. So that's just, you know, some of the ideas in terms of innovation and technology. So Eli, if you'd go to the next one. Now, you know, all of us on this panel are fortunate enough in some way to be involved with education. And Michael and I are both based in sport management programs. Michael's at University of Houston. I'm at the University of Louisville in Kentucky. But we have the great opportunity and have been given the great responsibility to educate current and future sport managers. And one of the ways that we can help get disability sport, again, to the table and building allies, as Eli had mentioned before, and build those numbers up, as Michael has mentioned from his data, is for sport management students to learn about disability sport. And to that, what I'm encouraged by is that we're seeing sport management curriculum at universities, colleges and universities, adding units about disability sport, about the Paralympic Games. And they're not doing it in a way that it's like, oh, here's sport and here's the NBA and then here's that sport for people with disabilities, like it's special. No. You run the Paralympic Games like you run a multi-sport international event. You run a wheelchair basketball tournament like I know there are, yes, of course, there are nuances, but it's like you're running a basketball tournament, all right, an event. And that's what I think is important, is when our future sport managers come to realize this is just part of the industry, all right? And we need to work with and develop this part of the industry. But I'm also encouraged and I'm a little biased here, that we're starting to see more information about sport for people with disabilities in sport management textbooks. I will say that when I did my the first edition of my sport governance book in 2004, it's now gone into the 4th edition, but I specifically told the publisher, I will not do this book unless I'm putting a standalone chapter on Paralympic Games. And there had never been a sport management textbook that had it before. So yeah, the publisher said yes. Okay. And we're starting to see that covered more and more. So I thought that was kind of cool opportunity to see that and now to see the growth. So know that we are doing the best we can to educate our young people. And it's a privilege for us to do that. This next slide, then again, just going forward here, thinking about the next generation, how we're projecting to 2028 and beyond. But I want to think about 3 pillars here, 3 pillars that could help support us in this movement forward. And that's how sport and sport for people with disabilities, adaptive sport, how it relates to connection, innovation, and resilience. And I will call your attention to the picture on this slide, because on this slide we have, I'm a qualitative researcher. I guess there's 20. There's 20 people there in the picture. And, you know, everybody knows, of course, that the Boston Marathon was not able to take place as typically scheduled this year because of COVID. But instead, what we had was a number of Paralympic athletes who decided to, because they had this connection of the marathon, and they had an innovative idea of using social media, and they are resilient and wanting to promote their sport and disability sport generally, that these people, wherever they were, trained at the marathon course distance. As you can see, they're all on their inside, like training, you know, on their trainers indoors. And they did the mileage there in solidarity with each other, but in connection using innovation and showing our resilience. So I thought that was a great picture to have on this slide, Eli. I'm glad you put that on there. But again, just the idea of what sport can do in terms of connecting us. And as we move forward, I think, particularly now when we are quite fractionated and working at home or wherever we might be till it becomes safe for us to come back together, these connections that we have, like we have today, over 600 people. I was looking, over 600 people today. Awesome. We're connected, aren't we, by sport? We're innovative by what we're doing here. By goodness, we've got resilience. But as we move forward, we are going to need to rely on trusted and informed guidance. And that trusted and informed guidance will need to take, we're going to get that from the scientists. We're going to get that from people who have the data that are going to help us move forward, beyond 2028 in a fashion that helps us live healthier lives as we all go forward. So again, I think that's something that we're all going to need to find in our own way, is who that trusted and informed guidance, where that comes from. But certainly it is out there for us. So again, keep those connections going, encourage innovation, and live off our resilience as we always do. Eli, I'm going to turn it over to you because I believe that was our last sort of talking slide. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Mary. And thank you, Mike. And we've sort of come to the close of our formal remarks here, and really thinking about this whole conversation about the next generation and the future of adaptive sport. Really try to just highlight a few things using this framework of leadership and advocacy, and then looking at some of the youth dimensions, the marketing, and then also looking at innovation, technology, and education. So we really was hoping to use this as kind of a way to kick off a conversation, to be able to address, some of the questions that are coming in, and also, for us to share any follow-up. I see, and maybe Mike, if you can also see some of the questions in the Q&A. There's some questions coming in. Maybe we can start with some of the questions just about the research that you shared.
Sure.
There's some questions about like the numbers and kind of how we're looking, and maybe Mary too, just in terms of the marketing, traditional marketing versus new ways of marketing. So I'm just looking at the Q&A. There's about 11 open questions here from some people we know, Danny Ferreira and Joe Walsh and Karen Korb and others. So maybe Mike, do you want to take a crack at
Sure.
responding to some of those questions at first, and also Mary as well?
Sure. I mean, I can just, a couple people asked about how we determined disability. We left that open to the program organizers. We first thought about going at this at a micro level. We were, contacting individuals to determine participation, but that was pretty unfeasible. So we reached out to the organizations. We asked them for their self-reported numbers, and there were organizations that would decline. They were like, "Well, we're dance, and we don't consider dance sport." Well, if you don't want to be defined as this, then we won't put you on our data set. Or, some groups who were deaf said, "Yeah, we think we'd be part of this," or others said, "No, we would not." And so we respected and defined that however those organizations elected to. So I think that we left that up to the discretion of the individuals. And I'll give you guys a technical report to look at where all the numbers came from. But it was really surprising to me, because I'm absolutely a pragmatist and a realist, and I did not think the numbers were going to look that good. And when, we spent about 18 months collecting that data, and at the end I was like, wow. And we're talking everywhere from Puerto Rico to Alaska, from end to end, right? Any territory. America Samoa, I think, had 4 participants. So we literally looked everywhere. And I'll be glad to kind of show that to you guys. But a lot of kids, as you would imagine, are doing multi-sport participation as well, right? And which is, I think, really healthy at that age. A few questions that were asked about the marketing. Dan, I think that's a really important question. Right, there's 2 models, right? If we look at disability, in the spectrum, really. If we look at disability sport on the spectrum, with categorization of disabilities, the ITF and International Tennis Federation has basically said, we're not going to be very reflective on disability types, and we're not even that worried about creating an equitable playing field for disability types, because in part we want this to be a marketable product, right? And we want it to be digestible. So as long as someone has a qualifying disability, it's basically, are you a quadriplegic or are you something that's not a quadriplegic? Those are their only metrics. And what they've been able to do is they've been really able to effectively garner public support, garner a lot of resources. In part, that is because of the power of international tennis and resources that draws. But in part, that's because they've really removed the complexity of what disability is from their sport, right? Because it's virtually everything from a T1 level para to a very low level, bone disorder could potentially all be in the same division. If you look at other sports which have multiple divisions of disability, it does get really confusing for the spectator. I mean, I think it would be disingenuous to say it didn't, right? I think, Dan, your background in basketball, I think it can be a little confusing, but I think what we have been able to show in terms of what's effective for marketing, we know that just telling people to go like volunteer or engage in their community is actually not very effective. Most of the research, like if you just say, go find a place to volunteer with disability sport, the students that are motivated, who are already probably fairly open and proactive and have positive thought processes, they tend to find really great experiences, and other ones just tend to try to get a piece of paper signed. So like that doesn't work very well. We do know that what works pretty well is participatory experience, which I think someone else referred to. I think Abby hit that. Getting people to hop in a chair for a period of time and practice a little bit and just dive in makes a tremendous difference in terms of people's experiences.
Exposure. Yeah.
Getting people to giving them just a brief app or documented explanation of players to watch. Classification system is valuable, but if you tell them the players to watch and the roles they will play, you're going to get more bang for your buck that way in terms of just getting people to buy in and become fans. In terms of how long they have to do it, the studies we've looked at, and again, we don't have enough out there. It looks like if you get someone to play in a chair for like 15 minutes, you can get them to sort of to respect and understand the athleticism of the sport. So at least that works for certain ball-based chair sports. So those, I'll look at some other questions.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
You want to pass it on to someone else?
Yeah, Mary, do you want to reflect on any of the questions or any particular aspect of?
I was sort of looking over to see which sort of, there was a question from Evan early on, Evan Davis, that asked whether or not I've looked at esports in my research. I haven't. I mean, I haven't written about it or researched it, but I'm kind of fascinated by it in terms of the number of eyeballs that people are watching it and that are competing into it. And I'm also interested in that discussion of whether or not it really is a sport, a game, a competition, whatever it might be. What I find is in class when we talk about it, more and more students are beginning to see it as a sport management students. They aren't just dismissing it as, this isn't the NBA, or, they're starting to realize that these esport athletes train for hours. And I want you all to think about it. I don't know about you, but do y'all ever get Zoom fatigue? Like I get Zoom fatigue. Man, I get zoomed out these days. Now think about if your job as an esport athlete, for which you're being paid perhaps millions of dollars in sponsorship money, or winnings, is to sit in front of a computer all day long. And so they train, they have to mentally, physically. So, I think there's been a little bit of a shift in the tide as to whether or not it's a sport, a game. I think we all agree it's competition. So anyway, but I haven't looked at it specifically, but I just think it's a way to get eyes to the games. I think it's any of these video games. It's a way to get eyes to disability sport. It would be, I think, potentially ways to engage sponsors. There's a lot of, the sponsorship value in esports is pretty high, but you have to make sure that you get the partnership that works for the sponsor as well as for the property, and that you're getting that as a lot of times, are organizations just sponsoring disability sport because it's not just medical related or organizations that are sponsoring disability sport. Now, of course, as we know, it's more and more mainstream, but it's because from a business partnership perspective, people are saying how can we value this partnership? I have a doctoral student who's working on looking at partnership values, and particularly she'd been looking at professional wheelchair rugby in Germany, and very interesting, what she's looking at. And we're going to continue to keep working on that to see how do you best match partnerships of sponsorship and disability sport properties. So
there's a couple of questions, and there's a couple that I wanted to address, but I also wanted to just touch base with Wyra and Julia and Kayla, if there's any questions that you felt would be good for us to tackle, feel free. There's a couple that I saw that were just about, reaching out to different industry stakeholders and how do we have influence with mainstream sports, with media, with universities. And I guess one of the things that I feel like we found in our both practical work, but also research is around networks. So the whole notion of networking and how do you get to the table and who do you know and how does that kind of play out? That a lot of the influence and the ways of being able to get adaptive sport to the table and as a priority is through relationships. It's through actually getting to know somebody, getting to build a relationship with somebody of influence. Whether that is kind of building the relationship with the marketing department at a university or the president of the university or the athletic director of the university. And how do you then build those relationships in really meaningful ways? But it also has to do with how do you get the buy-in? How do you really make sure that the CEOs of NGBs and the CEO of even professional sport, how does the NBA and the NFL and Major League Baseball and, how are the commissioners actually thinking about adaptive sport on some level? And so there is an interesting part of this conversation about the influence in the future of adaptive sport that is about networking. And it is about who do we know and how are we getting to the table. I think that's in many ways been, with whether it's been with working with professional leagues or with the NCAA, with ESPN or Nike, a lot of it has been just about relationships. And so I do think that as we see the growth and the development and the future of adaptive sport, it's going to be about how do we begin to cultivate those relationships? Are we in the room with Sport Business Journal and, the mainstream sports industry networks? And, that's something that I think about a lot. And I'm not sure if Mary or Mike, if you also wanted to talk about that theme a little bit, because looking at some of these questions about how do we make change, a lot of it is with sports is about who do you know?
Yeah, I would agree. And also, I think when it comes to partnering, particularly with professional sports organizations, not just them, but particularly, they're going to want to know ROI. Yeah. That is what they're going to know. What is our return on investment? So, I think, and again, perhaps we in adaptive sport, Paralympic sport movement, maybe we need to be more innovative in our thinking in getting the message across to, that it's, yes, we want to promote healthy living. We want to promote, competition. We got to promote the business side of this. And how do we get that notion that, yes, it is worth it for X corporation to invest in us because they're going to get that return in investment. I know sometimes it can be a bit circular, but that's really, I think, what you have to get in front of the CEOs and in front of the GMs.
I would like to follow that. Yeah. That's exactly where I was going to go. Just to give you guys one stat, this is one that came out of our lab that I think is effective. You know what the employment rate is for wheelchair users nationwide? 18%. Less than 1 in 5 has a job. For those that participate in sport, that goes up to 64% over time. If you look at the economic impact just on employment alone, not to mention, so yeah, we're going to deal with issues of people taking this target of saying, yes, it's inspirational. Wow, we feel really good that we gave to this cause. But if we can help them transition to saying, oh no, this is a really good economic investment, that we're getting people back in the workforce. We're getting people in happy relationships. We're getting them more independent. We're getting their health better. We have measurable outcomes in terms of health and depression, how it impacts depression. And the greater your disability the impact of your disability is, the more you'll actually see that ROI increase in terms of depression. So there's some really good metrics there. And we can help you if you want to reach out to myself or probably my colleagues here. We can give you guys some of that information. But it helps them sort of change that view. And it also helps us make a legitimate argument. If you're saying, okay, do you want to give money to this program that has 300 people with disabilities, or do you want to give this program that has 8,000 kids at a Boys and Girls Club? Well, if you actually look at the return on investment, we do really great work in terms of getting people back in the workforce, in terms of addressing issues like depression, in terms of addressing issues like education. The return on investment in disability sport is just about as good as it gets. So that helps us push away from that inspirational narrative.
Yeah. And that point about ROI also makes me think about how we're prepared, like how are we ready to know this data, to know how to make the case, to be professional and ready to convince others. And So I think that that's all connected of like, how do we continue to professionalize and push adaptive sport? And again, adaptive sport also thinking about all levels, whether it's at the elite level or the grassroots recreational levels too. At all these levels, it's about how does the ROI play out. So I think I'll turn it over to Wyra to see, or Julia, to see if we have about 10 more minutes. We want to make sure we address any key questions.
Yeah, thanks. This is Julia. We're getting a few questions from healthcare providers and around how to best engage people in the healthcare setting.
Sure, I can touch on it, or Mary or Mike. I think there is a growing effort now, particularly within the sports medicine community, in terms of sports rehab and the health sector, that is starting to look at and get engaged around adaptive sports. I mean, I can just speak briefly that my wife, Sherry, I think she may be joining, she's a part of the sports rehab community at Spalding Rehab, and also nationally the AC, American College of Sports Medicine, is developing more and more around adaptive sports. And so that movement is happening, but I think there's other colleagues at Michigan and Utah and other colleagues around the country that are really pushing for adaptive sports in that intersection with the health sector. But I know that the more that the broader adaptive sport community is behind that and sees that as a positive, this intersection between the rehab and health community and the adaptive sport outcomes and those that are working in the field, that intersection, especially from a data standpoint, I mean, there's so many positives that can come from that.
Thanks. And similarly, from kind of the collegiate level, where do programs fit in, and does there need to be an increase in efforts to create more disability sport-specific programs at the collegiate level, or how do you see that playing a part in this industry?
Yeah, I can speak to it briefly, and I'm sure Mike and Mary too. I mean, there have been efforts, and there continues to be efforts to look at growing. There's existing adaptive sport programs that are either in disability services, that are in academic departments, and even some that are in athletics. But there continues to need to be efforts to move that forward, to continue to get buy-in from athletic departments, from presidents of universities, from communities, to really help to support and move forward the adaptive sports at the collegiate level. There's different levels of what can happen at universities. There's the intramural and club sport level in terms of growing the programs and building more engagement. And then there's also getting to the varsity level. And so part of what we're seeing is kind of the proliferation and the growth of these kind of programs, particularly in terms of seeing them at the intramural and club level, just to get them started. But in terms of the formalization of them and the evolution of them into varsity sports, and you have to break it down. You have the individual sports and you have team sports. And so you have a number of programs around the country, but most of them, I would say, are in disability services or in academic departments. And so part of, again, going back to our points about coordination, about movement building, about, advocacy, in the same way that what we've seen with women in sport, Title IX, there continues to need to be more and more engagement. And again, going back to the points that Mike and Mary made about ROI and the business side of ensuring these programs have sustainability and have sponsors and support. But again, we're at this cusp of kind of the tipping point of what's possible at the collegiate level. There's been a lot of work over the last 10 years. And so, and continuing that momentum is really important. But I don't know, I can turn over to Mike and Mary. Any other comments?
Yeah, I guess one comment I would have, and it's kind of maybe a tough one to hear, but when you think about the opportunity to move more sports into maybe what do I want to say, varsity level and beyond, maybe for right now the intramural level may be the best level for us to, or a reasonable level for us to exist at. Right now, particularly in the COVID age, now this has changed everything. You're going to see universities where you're not going to have football being, well, we didn't have, the spring sports were gone. March Madness, think about the revenue reduction. I was on the board of directors for University of Louisville Athletics for a long time and had to deal a lot with budgets. And, just thinking budget-wise now it's going to be perhaps more challenging because athletic directors are going to be more thinking about how do I keep the programs that are in my athletic department surviving now in the COVID age when we're looking at a severe loss of revenue. Might be a little tougher to make our case to add something new. Or you can see it as perhaps a chance to say, hey, let's have some innovative thinking here. And can we rethink what this varsity model looks like? I think the NCAA is going to have to take a hard look in the mirror at all this, right, and everything right now because of COVID and the changes that are swirling around. And maybe there's an entree for us as well. I don't know. So you can kind of, again, look at it both ways. But, athletic director is going to be looking at the budget and what they can do with their facilities, and et cetera.
If I can just add two things. One is there's absolutely going to be brutal budget cuts at the state level for a while, as Mary was leading to. That's so like adding programs in the next 6 months is probably not realistically happening. But when money starts coming back, 24, 36 months, and we start really gaining momentum, it's not going to all go back in the same place. There's going to be opportunities to have that redirected, right? So if we put a real good goal timeline on that 24 to 36 months push, two movements. One is we're seeing states look at this individually. We're actually seeing there were 8 states that put on their that discussed in their legislative bodies some sort of, could we fund disability sport as a state action, right? It was put on the ballot in Texas. It was put on the ballot in Arizona. It passed in there. Like there were places that we saw that this happened. Didn't always get through. Most time it didn't, but it's getting put on where legislators are discussing it, and it's fairly bipartisan. So that's attractive. Secondly, we have to show those legislators that it's got to be about, that we're really still addressing diversity. And even though only a small percentage of students are going to utilize it, what you're doing is you're increasing diversity at your campus. And every student's more likely, after they see those programs and participate and just to get involved in them, they're more likely to date people with disabilities and become friends with people with disabilities and hire people with disabilities. And it's going to address inclusiveness on your campus far beyond the participants that will directly participate. And those are going to be your takeaway arguments when you go in that 24 to 36 month timeline to hit those colleges again.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you. Yeah. I know we're running up on time. We want to leave a couple minutes, so I'll turn it back to Ira. And thank you all so much.
Man, thank you, Eli, Mary, Mike. What a wonderful session. I know there's been a lot of conversation through the chat and a lot of questions answered. If we didn't get a chance to go through them all, we'll certainly follow up, but we really appreciate you sharing so much information. A lot of great progress being made and also a lot of food for thought and discussion, I think. So I would like to highlight that Move United definitely shares the importance and understands the power of sports. So we also share the vision of more inclusive communities. So thank you for all the great work you're doing in this space. We certainly echo the importance of connection, innovation, adapting at home during this current time, and absolutely resilience. Resilience is key. So thank you again. And we also understand the importance of trusted and informed guidance in adaptive sports. So we really, really appreciate everything you've shared today and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you to the 600+ individuals who tuned into this session. We'd love to hear your feedback. The link to the brief session, brief session survey is shared in the chat box, and it will pop up in your browser if you once you exit the session. We also certainly encourage you to stay involved in the conversation and share your thoughts throughout the conference on social by tagging #MoveUnited. So thank you again. I appreciate everything. And hopefully you will have other sessions that you will be tuning in later today or during this week. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.